Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
On New Mexico Now, we will talk primary elections as Democrats running for governor face off. And after the primary, we will have a better idea who will fill Republican Congressman Steve Pearce's seat in District 2, as candidates on both sides of the aisle share their thoughts on border trade and security. This is New Mexico Now. Welcome to New Mexico Now. I'm your host, Anthony Moreno. Joining us in studio is Walt Rubel, editorial page editor with the Las Cruces Sun-News, Sylvia Ulloa from New Mexico In Depth, and Angela Kocherga from the Albuquerque Journal. Thank you all for joining us. The primary election is just around the corner, and the race in the Democratic primary for New Mexico governor has heated up. U.S. Representative Michelle Lujan Grisham, State Senator Joe Cervantes, and former media executive Jeff Apodaca are on the June 5th primary ballot. The winner will face Republican Congressman Steve Pearce in the general election for governor, who is running unopposed in the GOP primary. Lujan Grisham, Cervantes, and Apodaca recently faced off in a KOAT-TV Albuquerque Journal debate. Let's talk about some of the issues brought up during that debate and also in the race. But first, I'd like to hear all of your thoughts on this race and the debate. What are some of the things you're taking away from it right now?
Well, I think when Michelle Lujan Grisham and Steve Pearce both gave up their seats in the U.S. Congress to run for governor, people expected that would probably be the matchup in November. At the debate, it was interesting. They had Lujan Grisham in the middle, so she was kind of catching it from both sides, which was probably appropriate. But I don't think anything happened either during that debate or thus far during the campaign that has really shaken those earlier predictions.
So you're saying no surprises so far?
No, I don't think so. They raised a few issues, but nothing that I think has really resonated in the minds of the voters as the kind of scandal that would really make a difference on Election Day.
Sylvia, your thoughts?
Well, I've been really looking at this race from the lens of what I've been covering, which is early childhood education and child well-being. I think that there's not a whole lot of difference between the candidates in there. I think that if you look at it, Joe Cervantes is really taking it from the perspective of I'm going to be a candidate who knows the legislature, can leverage my relationships, and can move a lot of issues forward that the current governor has not been able to do because she hasn't really learned how to play well with others when it comes to the legislature and even in state agencies. And Lujan Grisham, is definitely hitting it. It's really one of her signature issues. So it's been interesting to see some of the priorities that she's putting on, 80%, universal access to early childhood, preschool, and things like that. And I think with Apodaca, he's beaten the drum of it's all economic development all the time. And listening to that debate, it was pretty clear that was his answer to most of the problems that New Mexico is facing.
Angela, you cover southern New Mexico, the borderlands region. From your perspective of what you cover, what is your take on this race?
Well, it is fascinating. As you mentioned, both are leaving Congress. The front runner for the Democrats, the recent Albuquerque Journal poll shows she has a commanding lead over the two contenders. And of course, Steve Pearce, if they thought they were going to escape border issues, not likely. The current governor has made that a top priority for her administration. Susana Martinez, she's been down here with the National Guard, promoting the border wall. And we have seen Steve Pearce has not been in favor of the wall, and obviously the Democratic candidates are not as well. So border issues will figure highly as far as security and immigration, which those issues are always hot button issues, but also trade is so important to this region, and economic development and Santa Teresa and the border crossing. So voters will be looking to see in this region how that economic engine can continue to benefit the state.
Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about what's been brought up in this race and in the debate. Sylvia, you've been covering this, so child well-being, early childhood education, obviously some major issues here in the state. It dominated the last legislative session here in New Mexico as well. You mentioned Michelle Lujan Grisham's stance on this, kind of calling out the current governor about not working well with others. And she mentioned talking about bringing back a children's cabinet in the state. I'm a little curious, when you hear that, I mean, what does that exactly entail, and what can people expect with something like that?
Well, the way she explained it to me was that every agency within her purview would be required to work with a cabinet secretary that would be looking out for child well-being issues. They couldn't put forward a plan without getting that through that particular secretary. I think it's an interesting idea just because right now a lot of the child well-being issues are just split among 4 different departments at least that I can think of. The PED, the Public Education Department, Children, Youth and Families Department, the Department of Health. I feel like there's one more. And the education, yeah. So in that regard, I mean, that has been the problem that they've had all along. That's the reason why, we've had so many problems with CYFD, with the most horrific, recent horrific case of a child being prostituted by her parents. So I think that she's looking at that as a way to create some breaking down silos so that there are more cooperation among the agencies to help prevent a lot of these problems that we're seeing.
I mean, you brought up obviously a major issue and story with CYFD, with the Children's, Youth and Families Department. One of the issues, being with that department is the high turnover rate that's been in that department. Is this something that Democrats can really jump on, Walt, as far as that being an issue, or is this something that's always been a problem with the department?
It certainly, those of us in Las Cruces are familiar going back to the days of Baby Brianna, and it seemed like there were a spate of cases right around that time. That unfortunately this isn't something that's new. It's I think what they have pointed to recently that makes sense is that this has been in some ways a byproduct of 2 or 3 years of government funding cuts. And so they don't have the staffing in that department that they need, so that even in cases where people do the right things and raise the red flag and try to alert the state to a problem, they don't have the resources necessary to go out and do the investigation and to actually resolve the problem before these horrible things happen.
Yeah.
How much of the, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I did want to jump in there because I think at this debate, all of the candidates were talking about 25%, 30% vacancy rates in some of these agencies, and so that I think is something that they've talked about. It's something that the legislature has talked about as far as multiple agencies within state government that have been underfunded and have been starved under the current administration, which has refused to raise taxes.
And that includes judiciary as well, which has a huge role to play in that, obviously.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I want to move on to another issue, obviously, that was talked about in this debate and is going to be a big issue in the general: crime, public safety.
Right.
Many of people have touted that as they're running for office, at least in the last couple of years, on how to handle crime. Sylvia, you mentioned Apodaca obviously going to, blaming the economy, and he also mentioned the private prison's role in the system, which I found interesting. Lujan Grisham talking about working to bring more funding for law enforcement, and also working together again, as her mantra has been. Cervantes, kind of standing behind the stance of we need to enforce our laws and things like that. I mean, is this going to be an issue that the Democrats in this primary are going to be excited to jump on in the general election, Walt?
Well, one of the things I was glad to hear at the debate was Cervantes make the distinction between the crime problem in Albuquerque and the situation down here, in Las Cruces and other areas of the state. And he made the point that we need to be careful about taking a tougher on sentencing approach, which of course would apply to everybody in the state equally. I think the private prison issue is something that everybody who came in to talk to us at the Sun News brought up. The idea that we have these contracts where we I don't know if obligated is the right word, but we're paying for so many beds every night, whether we fill them or not. So there's an incentive to go out and arrest more people. And just that whole model, I think among the Democrats, there's a real eagerness to change that private prison model.
Well, I find it interesting. I want to move on because we just have a couple more minutes on this issue. One of the topics that obviously was a big issue at the beginning of this race was the legalization of recreational use of marijuana. Mm-hmm. Now, Jeff Apodaca from the get-go has been pretty much for this. We've seen Congresswoman Michelle Lujan Grisham, sort of walk things back to where she says certain things need to be in place. And of course, Senator Cervantes has been against it, although he has put forth legislation to decriminalize it. I'm a little curious right now, is Jeff Apodaca the only person who's in favor right now of legalizing recreational use of marijuana from what you've seen so far? Any thoughts on that?
I would just say that issue, a lot of these candidates seem to be trying to skirt it because they know that it does have popular support statewide. We saw what happened in Albuquerque specifically. So I think they're trying to play both sides and say, well, we'll see, maybe decriminalize, but it is an issue. And the other issue you talked about, the problem of drug abuse, opioid abuse, that also ties into the childhood abuse and neglect and the crimes that we're seeing throughout the state. A lot of these hard drugs are fueling those crimes.
So with this issue, I'm a little curious though, is this going to be, are some people walking back this issue perhaps because they don't want to talk about it in the general election?
I think they have three real distinctive points or positions. As you mentioned, Apodaca is legalize. Lujan Grisham is, I can get to legalize if you can show me we're doing this with public safety and this with workplace safety. Cervantes is saying he can't get to legalize until they have a roadside sobriety test similar to what they have with alcohol, which who knows how long that would take. So the three really are in three very distinct positions on that issue.
All right, well, we're going to move on to our next topic. Republican and Democratic candidates are facing off in the upcoming primary election to fill the New Mexico Congressional District 2 seat, held currently by Republican Congressman Steve Pearce. Let's start off by talking about the Republican primary for this congressional district, where New Mexico State Representative Yvette Harrell, former Hobbs Mayor Monty Newman, and college professor Gavin Clarkson, and also Claiborne Griffin, who comes from a digital marketing background, are all campaigning for the seat. Some general thoughts about this race. Walt, you want to start us off?
Well, to me, one of the most interesting things about this race on both sides are the people who got in and then got out. And so on the Republican side, you had Aubrey Dunn originally was in the race, and everybody thought he was going to be the big dog. He decided to turn libertarian and run for the Senate instead. So that sort of, I think, opened the door for Monty Newman and Yvette Harrell, who are probably the two with name recognition and some kind of. Yvette Harrell has won, I think, 2 races as a state senator, maybe 3. Monty Newman was at one time the Democratic Party chairman, or I'm sorry, the Republican Party chairman. So they have a little name recognition. Gavin Clarkson is a fascinating guy who I met for the first time as part of this campaign, and I think the voters are probably meeting him for the first time too. And Mr. Griffin, I spoke to him over the phone, and I suspect most of the voters will never get a chance to meet him. So I think it's probably coming down to a 2-person race between Yvette Harrell and Monty Newman, and very close on most of the positions between them.
Well, I think it's a fascinating race because you do have 4 candidates, everything from veteran politicians with a lot of name recognition, really going head to head, Monty Newman and Yvette Harrell, and then you have the political newcomer coming out of Lovington, another region of the state we don't hear a lot about down here because it's such a huge district. And of course, Gavin Clarkson raised his profile with the whole dispute about being fired because he was in the Trump administration. So it's gotten a little nasty too out on the campaign trail, but they all, except for one, seem 100% to see a benefit from saying they are big Trump supporters, will follow the Trump agenda, and they see, at least in the primary, a huge benefit to that. All support a big crackdown on illegal immigration and the border wall, except for Gavin Clarkson. who is out, Griffin Clarkson, out in Lovington, saying he is not for any of that. He has a different approach when it comes to immigration.
Yeah, he mentioned something interesting, which obviously I was a little bit surprised. He kind of called out the Republican Party in some ways by saying if we want to be, the party of family values, in his words, then we need to not tear apart families. Were you a little surprised to hear that coming from somebody in this race?
Not at all, because he, in an extensive interview, he said that he's more looking at kind of the Reagan Republican approach, even the Bush approach, to a compassionate conservative, and saying instead of going after families and also workers that this state depends on in key industries, yes, crack down on drug trafficking, human trafficking, that type of crime, but when you're running around trying to pick up, grandmothers on the way to the store to buy milk, he sees no benefit in that.
So do you think that this race really is who can support President Trump's border enforcement policies, or just policies in general that have to do with the border region, the best? Is that really what this race is about?
I don't think so, because if it is, then I think Yvette Herrell wins. But I think she's too far to the right, even for Republicans in southern New Mexico. We'll find out.
Well, Monty Harrelson even took it a step further. He wants everyone deported, including DACA recipients. So he's even gone further than Yvette Herrell.
Well, she told us she wanted DACA recipients deported too.
Yeah, well, maybe they're both now trying to up the ante, because it is a primary and they're appealing to this base. They're going to have to, when the general election comes, see how that's handled.
Well, yeah, so the general election, everybody's running right now. They're going to have to run back to the middle in the general?
I think there's some positions you take that are just hard to untake. When you're talking about deportation being a magnet and drawing all of these people, and we need to have deterrence, I don't know how you walk that back and take an opposite position on that.
One of the things in this race, in this district, I should say, that is a major issue is trade. The port in Santa Teresa is such a big economic driver for imports in the state. With President Trump's tough talk on NAFTA and renegotiating NAFTA, obviously he's not a fan of the trade. How excited are these candidates, addressing this issue when it comes to trade?
Well, they're willing to say, and all have said, well, we can renegotiate NAFTA. None of them, I think, are in favor of getting rid of it. They do know it's a benefit for this region and for the state. It's an economic engine. The other issue that they are concerned about, tariffs that are affecting pecan growers, those types of things, farm and rural legislation that they would be weighing in on. And so they've seen how the tariffs, China, has retaliated by taxing higher nuts, which include pecans in this region. It's a huge blow.
But I got the sense that even on issues where they disagreed with the president, they tried to find a way to come to an agreement.
They are not going against the president. They're really looking at turnout, and they're hoping that President Trump can get those loyal supporters to go to the polls, because that's going to be a big issue. Who's going to actually turn out on primary day?
Let's look at just the geographic impact of this seat. I mean, obviously, it's been Steve Pearce won this seat back in 2010. But, the person who had it before him was from the eastern part of the state. Does being from the eastern part of the state give you a strict, a set advantage in this race?
I have often wondered, if not for the death of Harold Reynolds, who was going to run uncontested the first year of that brand new district, and he dies during the campaign, and Joe Skeen wins as a write-in campaign, and the Republicans have basically held it ever since. In the Democratic race, one of the things that Xochitl Torres-Small told us was that she doesn't think the district is as partial to Republicans as it is partial to incumbents, and that may be true.
Very interesting. Well, we're going to move on to the same district, but it's the Democratic primary for the District 2 seat. Water attorney Xochitl Torres-Small and Matt Hildebrandt, a veteran and online history professor, are on the ballot. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this race right now. What are your thoughts, Walt?
Well, this one's a little bit contentious too, not over the issues. I think Matt Hildebrandt and Xochitl agree on 99% of the issues. Madeline Hildebrand is kind of running as the outsider, and she claims that the Democratic Party, both in state and the National Party, are putting their thumb on the scale, so to speak, in support of Torres Small. She says that because she's married to Nathan Small, that's a dynasty, and they're this big political family. So that's how she's playing it, and I think she's certainly right that the money and the support from outside of the district that has come in has probably gone to Sochi. But it's both of them are brand new, and so going into the general, both of them will probably be a little bit behind in terms of name recognition, and they'll be doing this for the first time, and so there will be a learning curve for whoever comes through.
Getting your thoughts on this race?
Go ahead.
I would just say they're part of this wave of women candidates, and both I interviewed said I decided I need to no longer be on the sidelines. I'm willing to run, and they saw an opportunity with an incumbent leaving to actually make a difference. They both also know that they have to appeal to conservative Democrats, and the big giant rural part of that actually goes out and votes, and the eastern part that you mentioned, they are both First Amendment Democrats. They're both gun owners, and they are very proudly talking about, yes, there can be common sense gun laws, but they also want to make sure that they are, they're not trying to take anyone's guns. And in our extensive questionnaire for the Albuquerque Journal, the voter guide, we get into all of these issues, and it's fascinating to see there are some nuances between the candidates, but when it comes to those issues, they sound very, very much like their Republican counterparts.
I mean, does that, I'm sorry, Sylvia, do you want to jump in?
I'm kind of curious about that because I think that they're pretty similar on the issues in the Democratic primary, but when it goes to the general, when it goes to the wider region, you got to wonder how, these are definitely, it seems to me, candidates that are in the mold of this new Democratic wave that's coming on. Like, we're going to try to run as left as we can because we should just own that and not worry about trying to be these centrists. Let's go full Bernie. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays in a wider arena once you get outside of the more liberal areas of the 2nd Congressional District.
I think on some issues that's right. On health care, both of them I think favor some form of single payer. But on other issues, the more cultural issues, then they're not so eager to go to the left. So you're right, and it will be interesting to see how far to the right the Republican candidate has to go to come through that primary.
Walt, I want to talk about something in this race that you brought up a little bit. You mentioned that Mad Hildebrand was running as the outsider, right. And Xochitl Torres Small. One of the things about her candidacy is she entered the race pretty late.
She did. Very late.
Mad Hildebrand and there are other candidates in this race. Oh, what, a year ago at least?
Yeah, right. I can't even remember them all off the top of my head, but there were 3 men that I know for sure, and so it is interesting that it comes down at the end to a race between 2 women. What Xochitl told us was that she was waiting. She had I don't know if she had a specific list, but she had an idea in mind about who she wanted to run for that office. And when that person didn't step forward, you're right, late in the game, she decided to get in. And it did seem like she had she had her ducks in the row in terms of getting support right away. As soon as she announced she had backing from important places, it seemed like.
Angela, do you have any other thoughts on Torres Small entering this race?
It was late, and Mad Hildebrand did make that a point of saying that she is that being backed by the Democratic Party, and so there is a fight over this, who is the real candidate. But when you look at them, they're both very similar on the issues, and will appeal to, but it'll be down to the wire. Of course, Xochitl Torres has a lot of support economically, and she does have the political know-how, having been out in the field with Senator Tom Udall. But Madeline, in a race where people see being an outsider as a real advantage, that could help. And someone who sees that the playing field's not fair, the voters may decide. We'll have to wait and see. It'll be fascinating to watch.
Well, one of the things about this race is there's a lot of excitement around it. For a lot of years, this has been a Republican stronghold over this seat. But this year, thanks to the outcry of what some may say the President Trump's policies, that it's up for grabs. Do you think, Walt, that this is really the best chance in years that Democrats may have at this seat?
There has been a lot of frustration among progressives in Las Cruces, especially in this part of the district that isn't as conservative, over the policies of Steve Pierce and over the idea that it really, a lot of the things that he stood for were antithetical to their beliefs and their values. And so I suspect there will be a very good turnout in this primary on the Democratic side. And I think there will be a lot of enthusiasm in the general election. The idea being that, Steve Pierce did give up the seat once before. Harry Teague won it for one term, and then Steve came back and ran and took it back again. And so the idea being on the Democratic side, if they do win it this time, they can't just keep it for one term. It can't just be a caretaker kind of thing. They have to get somebody who can go in and make a little bit of a name for themselves and a little bit of a splash and hold on to it the same way that Steve Pierce did.
Angela, do you have any thoughts on this race in general, where it is right now?
I think turnout's going to be key, and I think there is a lot of excitement, and we will see people heading to the ballot box, unlike our nearby state of Texas, which had a horrible, pathetic turnout. So that's the key, and the problem that Republicans do turn out in larger numbers, which is why they've been able to hold on to the seat for so long. So we'll see.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens. We are unfortunately running out of a little bit of time, so I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you to Walt Rubel, Sylvia Ulloa, and Angela Kocherga for joining us. You can like us on Facebook and also follow us on Twitter at KRWG for the latest news and also programming announcements. Remember, we love to hear your story ideas and topics for this program and others. You can email us at feedback@nmsu.edu. Thank you so much for joining us for New Mexico Now. I'm Anthony Moreno.